Early in the 19th century, Lewis and Clark were dispatched by the United States government to explore the vast, unknown west of North America. Their expedition uncovered a wealth of resources and economic possibilities, including a huge potential for trade. After they returned east, however, questions remained. How do we move people and goods across this high, wild, and sometimes hostile region? How do we get across the Rocky Mountains? The most suitable answer turned out to be South Pass, a broad, beautiful, and desolate opening through the rugged mountains in the region we would later call Wyoming.
Picture a young United States of America in 1810. People are all abuzz about the return of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the tremendous amount of furs that they encountered, valuable, worth millions and millions of dollars. So the richest man in America was named John Jacob Astor, was involved in the fur trade. In 1810, put together a company he called the Pacific Fur Company, his idea being to take advantage of all this fortune in furs that exists out in the Rocky Mountains.
Astor had launched a two-part expedition, one on the vessel Tonquin that sailed around the tip of South America to the mouth of the Columbia River to establish a trading post which was called Fort Astoria. The second part was an overland journey, and Astor had chosen a man by the name of Wilson Price Hunt to lead the expedition of about 65 people to Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River.
Wilson Price Hunt originally planned to follow Lewis and Clark's route, but changed his mind when the group traveled through South Dakota and met up with John Hoback, Edward Robinson, and Jacob Resner, who had recently traveled across Wyoming.
Now, these three individuals had spent some time traipsing through modern-day Wyoming, and they informed him that with the hostilities of the Blackfeet on the upper Missouri, that Hunt should take his party overland through Wyoming. So they head west through the Badlands, they enter into Wyoming, they travel over the Bighorn Mountains, and then finally down to the Wind Rivers. Well, eventually they'll make it up to Union Pass and cross over and enter into Sublette County, and then eventually continue on to Teton Pass, where they cross the Teton Range. Well, this trek through Wyoming was an important one because Hunt was able to meet with the Crow and the Shoshone Indians and learn about some of the geography of the area and about how to cross the Continental Divide.
The ones who went west, they started in 1810, but they really didn't leave Missouri until 1811. And they reached the Pacific coast early in 1812.
Well, when they arrive at Astoria, their numbers augment the people that are already there and enable the Astorians to expand into the Columbia River Basin. With that expansion then, the partners decide that they need to tell John Jacob Astor how they're doing. So they dispatch Robert Stewart and 6 men to travel overland to go make their report back to Astor.
And so the plan was to go to St. Louis and then from St. Louis on to New York, where Stewart could meet with Astor. And Stewart left Astoria in the summer of 1812, and there were only 6 people going with him. When the Astorians came west, I believe they had 61 men, 1 woman, and 2 children. When they were going east, 7 people.
Robert Stewart was born in Scotland in 1785. In 1807, he left Scotland to become a clerk for the Northwest Company in Canada. A few years later, John Jacob Astor enlisted Stewart to become part of the new enterprise, the Pacific Fur Company. Stewart was part of the group who sailed on the Tonquin around Cape Horn to establish Fort Astoria on the mouth of the Columbia River. Stewart became a leader in Astoria. He dealt with deserters and disagreements at the fort. He also dealt with the native tribes in the area, and he became very knowledgeable about their cultures and backgrounds. Based on this experience, Stewart was an obvious choice to lead the overland group back to St. Louis.
He was a fellow with grit. He was a fellow that exhibited some of the tough qualities that the Scottish people are known for. He seems to have been able to stand up for his ideas and also listen to the people who had the frontier experience to get them through. He really depended on the other 6 people. All 6 of them had a lot more wilderness experience than he did, but he was the one at critical moments kept them together and kept them from splintering off and giving up on the enterprise and probably dying in the mountains.
Robert Stewart departed Fort Astoria on June 29, 1812 with 6 companions: Ramsey Crooks, Robert McClellan, John Day, Benjamin Jones, Andre Valet, and Francois Leclerc. All the members of the group, except for Stewart himself, had been part of the Wilson Price Hunt overland expedition the previous year. Soon after beginning the journey, John Day became mentally unable to continue the trip, so he returned to Astoria. Their route took them by boat up the Columbia, and then overland through the Snake River country. Here, Stewart's group encountered Hoback, Robinson, and Resner, the trappers who had helped Hunt's expedition find the path through Wyoming. Joseph Miller, who had resigned his shares in the Pacific Fur Company earlier in the year, was also with them. The trappers were fortunate Stewart's group found them.
Well, first off, we're very lucky for this particular group of people is that Robert Stewart kept a very detailed journal. He was educated, his father was a schoolmaster, and he wrote well.
Went east by south 12 miles across 2 bends. Where going to drink, we found John Hoback fishing, and in an instant, Mr. Miller, Edward Robinson, and Jacob Resner, who had been similarly employed, came out of the willows and joined us. They suffered greatly by hunger, thirst, and fatigue, met us almost in a state of nature, without even a single animal to carry their baggage.
They hook up with Stewart's party and they travel on down the Snake to near where Twin Falls is today. And Wilson Price Hunt had left a lot of supplies in 9 caches, these underground storage pits that they dug the year before. And 6 of the 9 had been plundered, but 3 were still intact. And they were able to resupply Hoback, Robinson, and Resner, and they go down the Snake to about where Burley, Idaho is, just a little bit farther down, another 40, 50 miles, and they take off to go trapping again.
When Hoback, Robinson, and Resner left Stewart's party, Joseph Miller chose to stay with the group. Because Miller had been traveling the area for months, he believed he could guide the party on the next stretch of the journey.
And he convinces them to then leave the Snake right about the Port Neuf, cut over through Marsh Valley into about where Soda Springs, Idaho is, and they hit the Bear River. And Miller says, "Oh, hey, I recognize this." And Stewart calls the Bear River Miller's River. He names it in his journal, Miller's River. Well, the truth was that Miller didn't really know where in the world he was. They don't find the southern pass. They end up on the Grays River, which flows north, the complete opposite direction of what they want to go. And Stewart decides that rather than spend time looking around for this mythical southern pass, they're just going to go on north, find the Snake again, and get back to Henry's Fort, where they hope to find some horses.
Just as it seemed the group was going to get back on track, the party ran into some trouble near present-day Alpine, Wyoming.
They're camped there, and a party of Crow managed to stampede the what few horses Stewart has.
I had just reached the riverbank when I heard the Indian yell raised in the vicinity of our camp, and the cry, "To arms, there's Indians!" echoed by all our party. We had just time to snatch our arms when 2 Indians at full gallop passed 300 yards to one side of our station, driving off every horse we had.
So now they're left afoot. So they cobble together some packs, and anything that they think they can live without, they either burn if it will be consumed by fire, or they toss it in the creek because they don't want the Indians to prosper any more at their expense than they already have.
The American West is not an easy place to travel, particularly at this time period. Sometimes the Indians were friendly and helpful, but at other times they took materials, they took horses, they threatened violence, and so that bred a little bit of caution for the overlanders because their party, particularly Stewart's returning trip, was so small that it would have been very easy for them to be wiped out and all of their things to be taken. So his return trip, he tries to avoid Indian contact.
Crooks had chronic health problems. He was sick much of the journey going west, and as they were coming east again, he was sick. And at one point, they were in Idaho, in the Teton Valley, where the communities of Driggs and Victor are located. And it was October, and winter was coming on, and Crooks was sick. And one of the men suggested that they just had to leave Crooks behind. But Stewart wouldn't hear of it.
Mr. Crook's indisposition increased so much this afternoon that I insisted on his taking a dose of castor oil, which fortunately had the desired effect. But he has such a violent fever and is withal so weak as to preclude all idea of continuing our journey until his recovery, notwithstanding the urgent solicitations of my men to proceed without him, very justly representing the imminent dangers we exposed ourselves to by any delay in this unknown and barren tract. Such a prospect, I must confess, made an impression on my mind that cannot easily be described. But the thoughts of leaving a fellow creature in such a forlorn situation were too repugnant to my feelings to require long deliberation.
On October 4th, the party built an Indian sweat lodge for Crooks. He began feeling better and was again able to travel. Stewart's resolution to keep the group together was tested further as they traveled through some of the harsh terrain of present-day western Wyoming.
From the time they leave their first campsite, which is just a little bit south of the town of Jackson, is when their ordeal starts. Now, these men are on foot. They have little or nothing with them. Their guns, they have one trap, and by now they're a pretty ragtag bunch. Starvation becomes an incredible thing.
As we were preparing for bed, one of the Canadians advanced towards me with his rifle in his hand, saying that there was no appearance of our being able to procure any provisions, at least until we got to the extreme of this plain, which would take us 3 or 4 days. He was determined to go no farther, but that lots should be cast, and one die to preserve the rest, adding as a further inducement for me to agree to his proposal that I should be exempted in consequence of being their lead. I shuddered at the idea, and used every endeavor to create an abhorrence in his mind against such an act, but finding that every argument failed, and that he was on the point of converting some others to his purpose, I snatched up my rifle, cocked and leveled it at him, with the firm resolution to fire if he persisted. This affair so terrified him that he fell upon his knees and asked the whole party's pardon, swearing he should never again suggest such a thought. After this affair was settled, I felt so agitated and weak that I could scarcely crawl to bed.
Now, luckily for the group, the very next day, after walking a few miles, they came across an old, tired, tough-meated old buffalo bull that they were able to surround and eventually kill. And they ate some of it raw immediately. And then Stewart put the brakes on their eating and said, "You need to make broth and bring your stomachs back to life." So he had them boil up buffalo broth and drink that. And as their appetites returned, their healthy appetites, they spent the whole next day cooking and eating and cooking and eating and trying to bring themselves back to life. But that buffalo bull allowed them to live a few more days and allowed them to travel down the New Fork River through what's now Pinedale and go on down the New Fork and pass Boulder Creek and Pole Creek, and finally they got to where the East Fork River crosses the New Fork. And at that point they met 6 Shoshone people. And after convincing these Shoshone people that they needed to trade, that they weren't there to attack them, they took some of the trade goods that they brought along on their backs, and the Shoshone agreed to trade a horse and some meat and some leather to repair moccasins.
Refreshed, the group continued on from present-day Pinedale along the Wind River Mountains. Earlier in their journey, Stewart had encountered a Shoshone guide who told them of a pass through the mountains.
Hearing that there is a shorter trace to the south, than that by which Mr. Hunt had traversed the Rocky Mountains, and learning that this Indian was perfectly acquainted with the route, I without loss of time offered him a pistol, a blanket of blue cloth, an axe, a knife, and all, a fathom of blue beads, a looking glass, and a little powder and ball, if he would guide us from this to the other side, which he immediately accepted.
The Shoshone guide stayed with the group only a few days, but the information he provided convinced Stewart's party to pass through the Continental Divide by way of South Pass.
So that little bit of information that Stewart gathered fairly early on in the trip, he could use later to chart their route. And they became the first Europeans to pass through South Pass and live to tell about it. I cannot guarantee you that they were the very first group, because there were hunters and trappers in this area, small groups traveling on their own. So there might have been Europeans who saw South Pass. They may have even traveled through South Pass, but none of them wrote about it or talked about it. And so Stewart was it.
Really, for any group that was going west to the coast, they had to deal with the problem of how they were going to get across the Rocky Mountains. And Lewis and Clark had taken a northern route, and they had crossed the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass on the Montana-Idaho border. And then the westbound Astorians had crossed the Continental Divide farther north in Wyoming. They had followed the Wind River. Eventually they came over into the Green River Valley and then went west. Stewart was looking for a good way to get across the Rockies and had heard from Indians. So he went southeast from the Pinedale area, and I think it was around October 21st that they crossed what we now call South Pass.
That was the same direction that the Crow were going. Their journey would have taken them through South Pass and along the Sweetwater River. This was kind of an annual journey for the Crow people. They would come up the Wind River, and all they're doing is hunting buffalo, processing it, making things to take back to the Mandan villages for trade. And so their route would take them this way. Stewart wanted to stay far away from them. In fact, Stewart's journey through South Pass was near the Oregon Buttes. He was still up high on that branch of the Continental Divide.
We set out by daylight, and at the distance of 5 miles from camp, found a small stream of water and breakfasted. 10 more brought us to the head drains of a watercourse running east among banks and low hills of a loose bluish-colored earth, apparently strongly impregnated with copperas. Pursuing our course for 5 miles more along these drains, we at last found a little water oozing out of the earth. It was of a whitish color and possessed a great similarity of taste to the muddy waters of the Missouri.
He camped over on the east side of Continental Peak. His route takes him on to Muddy Gap, what we know as Muddy Gap. At that point he follows Muddy Creek up to where he can get onto the Sweetwater River, and then follows the Sweetwater to the Platte, and follows the Platte then down to what we know today as Bessemer Bend, just a little bit out south of Casper, and there he builds his first winter quarters.
After an encounter with some Arapahoes at their winter quarters, Stewart decided to move a bit further along the North Platte River and make a second winter camp just east of present-day Torrington. They resumed their journey again in early 1813.
After Stewart's party went through South Pass and then through Wyoming and Nebraska, they reached the Missouri River and arranged for canoes and floated down the Missouri to St. Louis. And they arrived late in April of 1813. Within weeks, the Missouri Gazette published a rather detailed account of their journey. It was presumably based on interviews with Stewart and Crooks and McClellan. So the newspaper basically announced that they had discovered South Pass.
That was the information that people would later need to know that South Pass was there. And then another 10 years, a little more later, other fur trappers made the practical discovery, and I call it the practical discovery in terms of they found South Pass again, and started using it. The difference with Stewart was he found it and he told people about it, but he never went back through it. And it wasn't until the 1820s that anybody went through it.
And it was Jedediah Smith in the 1820s who, in a sense, rediscovered South Pass. And it was after Jedediah Smith's discovery that South Pass became a kind of a thoroughfare. And as people started going to Oregon in the 1830s, they went by way of South Pass.
Jedediah Smith was the clerk of William H. Ashley and Andrew Henry. This partnership was planning to finance Ashley's political career through profits from the fur trade. The fur trade became a popular but risky way to build a quick fortune. Inexperience, encounters with natives, or just bad luck could cause these entrepreneurs to lose everything.
So in the 1820s, Ashley and Henry say, we're not going to use the river system and posts to be the way we access the furs. We're going to transform the entire trapping system by moving from Indian trappers to American trappers. Instead of fur posts, we will have an annual rendezvous where people could gather and meet and exchange their furs for supplies. And instead of river travel, we're going to use overland caravans that will bring out supplies to the rendezvous and take back all of the furs. These three innovations implement the rendezvous system. And the majority of all of the rendezvous in the West are held in Wyoming or very near its borders in Idaho and Utah, with the majority of them in the Green River Valley because it was centrally located, there was a lot of beaver there, and the Shoshones were so friendly. And so this became kind of the center, if you will, of the Rocky Mountain fur trade.
In 1832, Benjamin Bonneville brings the first wagons actually over South Pass and into the Green River Valley. So I think people are beginning to understand that you can get wheeled vehicles over that pass. There had been a wheeled cannon that was brought out earlier than that actually did come over across South Pass and ends up at Bear Lake. So the idea of using wheeled vehicles, is getting more and more play. And of course, by the time the fur trade is winding down, they're bringing wagons easily as far as Fort William, which became Fort Laramie, and then using caravans, pack caravans, to get onto the rendezvous. But the Whitmans, they bring a wagon over the pass, and you just see more and more, the wagons are coming, the wagons are coming.
Well, shortly upon the demise of the fur trade, the very next year, overland groups will begin traveling to Oregon because there had been some missionaries that had traveled to the rendezvous in 1835 and 36 and 37. These are men like the Spaldings and the Whitmans and the Grays and the Lees. And all of these missionaries, many of them with their wives, had moved into the Pacific Northwest. Some had settled along the Willamette Valley. And even though they weren't successful in establishing missions with the Indians, they did write back and say, this is beautiful country, you should come join us. So as a result, in 1841, a series of people will start forming groups to travel to Oregon, and the Oregon Trail crosses South Pass, this same route that had been identified by the natives, conveyed to Robert Stewart, and then rediscovered by Jedediah Smith. And so it comes full circle, but it takes several decades for it to come to play.
And so all of these pioneers, first you had all the pioneers going to Oregon, then the Mormon pioneers in 1847, and just a couple of years after that, the California Gold Rush, and so all the people going to California. Virtually all of those pioneers came through Wyoming, right over South Pass, as they were on their way west. So it really was kind of the gateway to the West. For whether they were going to Oregon, Utah, or California, they were all going over South Pass. And they all knew of the significance, and they would note in their journals that they crossed South Pass. It was kind of like getting halfway. And so it really became important to those pioneers.
They crossed over that southern pass, And it was just another day of drudgery for them. They had no, I don't think, any concept whatsoever of the historic nature of what they did.
Lewis and Clark showed that it was possible to travel across the continent using mostly water routes. The westbound Astorians, led by Wilson Price Hunt, found that a large group could travel overland to reach the Pacific coast. Robert Stewart led a group of 7 men through a route over the Continental Divide that became known as South Pass. Jedediah Smith used South Pass and told the world about it. It became a thoroughfare for the rendezvous fur trading system and eventually became the main route for thousands of pioneers settling Oregon, California, and Utah. It became Wyoming's original Main Street.